speaking with Fox News host Sean Hannity last week, Democratic presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. said he would change everything about how the federal government responded to the pandemic. Here's RFK Jr. in his own words.
I would have done everything differently. I mean, number one, the first thing that they should have done is to use they use the internet in many, many ways, usually to censor doctors and physicians who are trying to say, hey, I'm using a treatment, a protocol that actually works. I'm using therapeutics that work. Those people are silenced. We should have done the opposite. We should have used the internet, and we now have this extraordinary resource to link ourselves to the 15 million frontline physicians around the world and have them report what treatments were they using, what working. We know now there were dozens and dozens of therapeutic drugs that were off-the-shelf drugs that obliterated.
Are you talking about HCQ? Are you talking about Ivermectin?
Ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, Favipiravir, many others.
And then
I think there's a list.
Well,
I've seen a list that Peter Corey and Dr. McCulloch have published about 20 different drugs that were just devastatingly effective against those. But the problem was not only did they not focus on those, but they tried to prevent the public from getting access to them. And the reason for that was because there's a little known federal law that says you cannot give an emergency use authorization to a vaccine if an existing therapeutic drug that has been approved for any purpose proves to be effective against the target disease. So if they had admitted that hydroxychloroquine, which they knew from day one, that it worked against COVID, they could not. They discovered
Henry Ford Hospital, after the fact, came out and said that taken early, it mitigated symptoms. That's what I took out of that. And there were other studies that followed. I never saw one on ivermectin that showed it was effective. However, monoclonal antibodies seem to be a therapeutic that worked very well, but that was also experimental.
So the audience was extremely enthusiastic about RFK's statement there. Hannity pushed back against his characterization of ivermectin as being a proven COVID treatment. The audience did not seem to be interested in Hannity's pushback, which I think is accurate. RFK Jr. replied in a substantial colloquy, and again got round applause from the audience for citing studies that he saw, in his opinion, that did support the efficacy of ivermectin for COVID use in particular.
Yeah, and we've interviewed RFK Jr. twice now, and he brought up hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin both times. Look, it's a friendly dispute between us. I have looked at, I would encourage everyone to read a great long post by Scott Alexander, who's a free thinker, who's not someone who just agrees with whatever the expert consensus is on every issue. I think he's a great writer. He's a very influential Substack, Astral Codex 10. He did a long review of all of the studies on ivermectin, and you can certainly find some studies which showed a little bit of a benefit. You can find some studies who didn't show any of that, and then you have to go. Some of these are very low quality studies, and he says which ones he thinks are low quality studies and which ones are good studies. At the end of the day, it looks like maybe a slight positive, but I don't think the claim that some certain other populations in other countries totally were able to completely shut down and handle their COVID problems by mass prescribing ivermectin, which is essentially the claim that RFK Jr. made.
When I talked with Dr. Vinay Prasad about this on my podcast about a month ago, and we went through each of the claims that RFK Jr. has made, and many of them, as we discussed them, I think were actually valid areas of further scientific inquiry, at the very least. But on this one, this is one of the ones where he firmly was of the opinion that ivermectin, while it should not have been characterized as a horse tranquilizer, correct, and that was a kind of a liberal smear. Of course, it is medically indicated for treatment of human beings. They're two separate
yes,
drugs.
It's safe.
Right. That some of the purported advantages of taking it for COVID treatment might have to do with the fact that it's being prescribed in other parts of the world for other purposes, and that there's lower comorbidities among people who are taking ivermectin for whatever it is medically indicated for.
Parasites.
Parasites that exist in sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the world where it's more commonly prescribed. And that is what is driving some very marginal indications that it might be useful for COVID.
That's what Scott Alexander's post says as well. That, Alex Berenson, who is someone who has been extremely skeptical of the vaccine, has, publishes over and over again about the vaccines being not useful and bad, and, you can agree or disagree with that. He, too, has been skeptical of the ivermectin claim. So that there are other people out there in the skeptical of mainstream COVID opinions who are not sold on our ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, far from it, and I take their opinions to heart. So.
Yeah, this was a kind of a fascinating town hall. I don't think it got quite as much coverage as it probably warranted. There were some moments where RFK sounded like a real kind of Bernie-style populist, talking about how we have capitalism for socialism for the rich and rugged individualism for the poor. That was a little bit of a tension moment between he and Hannity. But again, RFK Jr. very firmly had the support of the audience, a conservative news audience ostensibly, but who seemed very on board with his characterization of how government services seem to endlessly give to the affluent, whether it's PPP loans or the like, while taking away from poorer or working class people. Additionally, Hannity asked him some questions about why it is that the Democratic Party hasn't been as frustrated with the various censorship regimes that we talk about a lot on this show, even though RFK Jr. is, why he is unique among Democrats for choosing to focus on those sorts of things. And he interestingly said, well, the Democratic Party isn't the party of censorship.
Did he mean it shouldn't be the party of censorship? It historically
I think he maybe meant historically, but there wasn't a lot of pushback there. There were a couple of...
The party of, it's doing plenty of censorship now.
Yeah, it was interesting.
Especially of RFK Jr.
And then another interesting moment, and we'll play a clip of this now, is happened when Hannity asked him to weigh in on whether Biden was fit cognitively or physically to be president of the United States. Let's watch RFK Jr.'s answer.
What I've tried to do during this campaign is avoid personal attacks on people. I will say, whether he's up to it or not, whether he's making his own decisions, the decisions that are coming out of the White House are bad decisions.
Right.
And, the Democratic Party does not censor people, in my experience. We're not the party of war. We're not the party of the neocons dictating foreign policy. We're the party of the middle class, and we're the party of working people. And that's not where the party is anymore.
Right. So he was saying that that's what the Democratic Party ought to be, and Joe Biden's Democratic Party is neoconservative on foreign policy, deeply insistent upon mass, large-scale censorship of dissenting points of view, and for all those reasons, he is running to replace Joe Biden.
Yeah, do you feel like that's a dodge? I saw some people saying, it's very frustrating. It almost feels like a Bernie 2020 redux if you won't just specifically say that you think that Joe Biden is unfit to run. A significant portion of Democratic voters believe that's true. They have concerns about his age and his cognitive health and fitness. What does it mean if your most successful challenger, an RFK, is unwilling to call a spade, and to the part of why he's running is because he's demonstrated a lack of fitness? Is that really a personal attack to say that he has demonstrated some cognitive decline?
I mean, I appreciate what RFK Jr. is trying to do there. He's trying to be magnanimous and not do personal attacks.
But is that a personal attack?
Well, obviously, we don't think it, because we criticize Biden's mental and physical state all the time. I mean, to try to do it politely, I think it's absolutely fair game. I think it's fair game. I think the age of our members of government is a crisis, that we've allowed these very elderly people to continue to occupy these positions of power for years and years and years, and there's no effort to fix that. So yes, I think you can call it out, but I respect the tactical, rhetorical choice he's made to just focus on the policies being bad, and saying that bad policies could come from someone who is who's in their prime, clearly all their cylinders firing, and just has really bad ideas and wants this to be a country where the government suppresses speech and on all sorts of subjects, and that would be bad. And it doesn't really matter if these are ideas coming out of Biden's head or the people around him who like puppet master him. They're just bad, and he's running against them. I understand deciding.
Yeah,
to
well,
run
the
that
audience
way.
was with him as well on that as they were through most of it. I mean, it was ironically Hannity came off sounding sometimes like the lib in the debate.
I mean, the audience can say they don't like personal attacks and then like them just fine when they hear them.
And again,
not
sorry,
that audience, but any audience.
I just don't think it was I don't think that that's a personal attack. I think it's a really sad thing in politics if you can't say a true thing about your opponent because you're characterizing it as a personal attack. That doesn't mean you are gratuitous. That doesn't mean you hit below the belt. But if a significant proportion of your voter base believes that there was a real health concern here and you're unwilling to talk about it, I don't remember people saying it was a personal attack to question whether or not Bernie was fit to run in 2020 because he had a heart attack. So I find this framing to be a little confusing. But broadly, what I was going to say about this exchange was how interesting it was that Hannity came off looking like very much a liberal next to RFK Jr. There were moments where he questioned him about Ukraine and seemed to know that the audience was going to be with RFK Jr. on his framing of how we should not be funding Europe's wars, but seemed to push back a little bit against it a little bit, characterize Putin as a kind of an existential threat, allude to the value of supporting our allies in Ukraine. And it's a really interesting exchange that I encourage everybody to watch.
Hannity is a more hawkish figure, I would say, in the conservative media environment. I'm not quite as informed on how his views on this may have changed or if they've moved with the kind of Republican tide that has definitely receded from the Bush years. But he's definitely not where, like, for instance, Tucker was on these issues, and that's probably what came through.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to observe how enthusiastic the audience was about RFK Jr. compared to some of the recent polls that we've seen where he's declined significantly in voter share. We'll continue to see how this plays out as he gets more mainstream interviews. More Rising after this.